Welcome to the first episode in this new series of close readings for the London Review of Books, hosted by me, Clare Bucknell.
And me, Thomas Jones.
And this is a series in which each month we will take a different 19th century British novel and close read it with a broad focus on questions of money and property and how they weave through the novels.
Yes, but not exclusively. We'll be talking
Not
about
exclusively.
them more generally as well. And most of the episodes, we will be taking it in turns to host them. But this time, as it's the first one, here we both are. And we're joined by Colin Burrow, who, of course, Claire spoke with for the Satire series of close readings last year. Hello, Colin.
Hello. Very nice to be here.
Very nice to have you.
And, of course, trying to narrow down the selection of novels from the many myriads published in the 19th century to reduce them to a mere dozen, trying to come up with constraints, I thought it might be fun to talk only about books named after houses. But as Claire pointed out, that would leave out North and South and many others, so we gave up on that. However, we are beginning, I'm very pleased to say, with a novel named after a house, Mansfield Park by Jane Austen. And to get us started, Colin, maybe you could run through what happens in Mansfield Park for those who have forgotten.
Well, all kinds of wicked things go on, don't there? Plays and other villainies. The simple way of thinking about it, I suppose, is as a fairy tale resituated in the early 19th century. So it's about Fanny Price, who is the sort of archetypal poor relation, who is sent to live with her much richer relations at the eponymous, good to get that word out there, the eponymous Mansfield Park, where she sort of sits silently in the corner, watching various misdemeanors, I suppose one might say. So her wealthy cousins put on a play while her uncle, Sir Thomas Bertram, is away at his plantations in Antigua. So, we're very much aware of the material base of Mansfield Park through that. And they do so in the company of the Crawfords, Henry and Mary, who are in some ways the wicked additional mixture of rather louche, modern, wild characters who flirt and fall in love with people that they shouldn't. And the plot, I suppose, unfolds broadly from there and involves elopements, ultimately, and Fanny's growing love for her cousin Edmund, who wants to be ordained as a priest. So you've got a very broad cast of characters brought together in that sort of single location of Mansfield Park, the house. But you also have a lot of other locations, which we'll be talking about, I think. They go on a rather disastrous trip, all of the cousins, to Southerton, another estate where all kinds of wicked things happen. And Fanny, at the end of the novel, is basically sent back to Portsmouth in order to learn that she ought to say yes to any rich man who proposes to her. And we'll talk, I think, a bit about the rather different social environment of Fanny's own poor family in Portsmouth. How's that for a plot summary?
Seems good. Very few spoilers as well. You kind of, who will...
We've learnt from our last series.
Which rich man will she marry?
Ha-ha!
And that, because the fairy tale aspect of it begins in some ways right at the beginning. You have three sisters, and there's the beautiful middle one who marries Sir Thomas Bertram, and then Fanny Price's mother is the younger one who marries a not very reliable lieutenant in the Navy. So that sort of three sisters, different fortunes aspect. But then that question of different fortunes, there's a very literal one, that there's a lot of sums of money are mentioned on the first page, aren't they, Claire?
Yeah, we are told exactly how many thousands of pounds Miss Maria Ward, who is the beautiful middle sister, is unworthy of Sir Thomas Bertram. So sort of matters of equity and inequity and who rightly deserves who come to the fore immediately. And we're also told quite what a bad decision the youngest, Miss Frances, has made, by marrying this penniless lieutenant of the Marines. And that sort of sets in train a whole structure of obligation, because Sir Thomas has to step in to do something for his newly acquired poor relations, which he would not have chosen. So exact amounts of money are given to us as the structure within which these people lead their lives.
And we mustn't forget the third sister, the older sister, the magnificent Mrs. Norris, although perhaps magnificent is a slightly strange adjective to apply to her, but I think she is quite magnificent. What happens to her? How does she fit in, I suppose?
Mrs. Norris is one of those sort of crucial characters in Jane Austen novels who is consistently absurd, consistently petty, consistently mean, and under a great obligation to people whom she seeks to manipulate. And she's a wonderful agent, really, of material acquisitiveness throughout the novel. Whenever there's a bit of leftovers anywhere, or a pheasant going spare, or a curd cheese, she will carry it off, and you'll never quite discover what happened to it, but she gets it. And so as the third sister, she's another, I suppose, type. You've got the feckless mother who's married the naval lieutenant, and you've got the Lady Bertram who is languorous and on the sofa with her pugs, who has made a good marriage. And then you have Mrs. Norris, who is there widowed and dependent and scraping around on the boundaries of the estate, picking up unconsidered trifles left, right and centre.
Just like Fanny Price. And it is, in fact, Mrs. Norris's fault, really, that this whole thing happens and Fanny is brought to Mansfield Park because Mrs. Norris persuades Sir Thomas that, wouldn't it be a nice thing if we could bring this poor young girl to stay with us? And I, Mrs. Norris, I swear, I will undertake to provide for most of her maintenance. And of course, she resolves, in fact, to do very little. There's a nice line, Austen says, "The division of gratifying sentiments or sensations ought not in strict justice to have been equal, for Sir Thomas was fully resolved to be the real and consistent patron of the selected child, and Mrs. Norris had not the least intention of being at any expense whatever in her maintenance."
It's a bit like going to a rescue home with your children, isn't it? And they say,
Battersea Dogs Home.
Yeah, Daddy, I'll walk it every day and I'll pay for the food. Oh, maybe I won't. Yeah. That's Mrs. Norris. But again, part of that network of dependency, which is so important in the overall texture of this extraordinary novel. Yeah.
I mean, is there some sense in which Mrs. Norris is, her motives are not entirely plain. She wants to appear generous, but she's so transparently not generous that doesn't work. But is she trying to bring someone else in to fill a place that she might otherwise be expected to fill herself, to be the poor relation, the Lady Bertram's companion? And by bringing Fanny in, she kind of gets out of having to fulfill that role herself.
I'd never really thought about that. I think you might be right. I mean, she wants somebody below her in the hierarchy in the household, doesn't she? So that she's not the person left at the bottom. And the person she gets, Fanny, is so unacquisitive and so undemanding that I think Mrs. Norris finds her frustrating because she fails to perform the social role that Mrs. Norris has imagined for her just by being quiet and so, well, sometimes rather painfully good.
And I think it's worth speculating how much Mrs. Norris, is oddly similar to Austen herself, a version of Austen, the sort of single, in her case, widowed sister who lives in the small house down the road and is sort of dependent on the big house. And for essentially a minor agent in the novel, she has an astonishingly large amount of stage time. So I wonder if there is some sort of satiric play going on there on Austen's part. This is the very worst version of how I could have turned out. Or is that too much?
No. We've done a whole series on satire, Claire, so you're getting carried away by the satirical element, I think. But I think it's true. It's certainly a self-portrait. I think there are sort of multiple self-portraits of Jane Austen running through this cast of characters, and Mrs. Norris is certainly one of them. The dependent. And Fanny Price, the dependent who behaves impeccably and keeps quiet on every conceivable occasion, is another version of, the quiet Aunt Jane who sits in the corner scribbling at her writing desk. Yeah.
Should we talk about Mansfield Park then, and the idea of the estate and sort of the other estate in the novel, Southerton? Tom, sort of how are those two estates framed? What kinds of places are they?
Well, the first thing to say about Southerton is it belongs to Mr. Rushworth, who is seen to be a suitable match for one of the Bertram sisters, particularly Maria, the older one. And Edmund, the younger brother, says of Mr. Rushworth, if this fellow had not 12,000 a year, he would be a very stupid fellow. But he's seen by Sir Thomas, sees him as he's a sort of stolid and not very bright and very rich man who lives in this enormous and lucrative estate with his mother. But there is this idea that it's a bit old-fashioned, that he sort of has these avenues of trees and which need to be, people with more modern ideas think need to be cut down, and Fanny thinks that's rather sad. And they all go for this disastrous day out that Colin alluded to earlier, with the idea that they can go and look at his estate and see how it can be improved. So there's this idea of improvement, which seems, when we were talking about themes for this discussion, that improvement was a word that we all seized on. And there's this idea that how Southerton can be improved.
Absolutely. And I suppose there's a wider point about the period in which Jane Austen's writing there, which is that it's Claire's the expert on GDP and economics generally, but a huge increase in wealth, and you've got to spend it somehow. And one way in which very rich people like Mr. Rushworth would spend their money in this period is on more or less pointless redesigning of their enormous houses, which could involve cutting down oak avenues. Hugely symbolic act, of course, because, Jane Austen is tied in with the Navy, which is completely dependent on the growth of oak. Oak isn't just a thing that gets in the way of the view. It ought to be regarded as a main commodity in keeping, in Jane Austen's case, her brother afloat on the seas. And here is Mr. Rushworth thinking about just sort of getting rid of that because it doesn't look very nice. So improvement is very much linked to Jane Austen's extremely acute perception of how money is changing the built world around her, and the way money is also being used to claim betterment on the part of people who are actually worse than their inferiors, morally speaking. And I think that's why improvement is such a crucial concept in the novel, really. Would you agree, Claire, as the expert on money?
Expert on money, yes. No, I think that's right. And it's almost as if by this quite late stage, improvement has sort of gone sideways, because when it first arrives as a concept sort of a century earlier and into the early 18th century, it's very practical. It's about, making your turnips work harder for you and sort of stuff like that. It's sort of intimately to do with farming and production of the land. But by this late point, it's, as Colin says, essentially a pastime that enables gentlemen to spend their money in sort of largely optical, symbolic ways, like, tearing down oak avenues. And it's not a coincidence that the character who is most obsessed with the idea of improvement in the novel is the most sort of mercurial, untrustworthy, sort of flickering figure of Henry Crawford, who sees Mr. Rushworth's estate and immediately thinks, you must improve it. I can think of 100 ways to improve it. And ditto with poor Edmund's presumed clergyman living at Thornton Lacey, which is, I guess, sort of quite a modest sort of house. And again, Henry wants to transform it and rip it up from the ground. So improvement is sort of meant to be about drawing out what's naturally there and just making it a bit better with human artifice. But here it becomes transformative in this dangerous way that Austen doesn't approve of.
But it's not just gentlemen who are preoccupied with improvement, is it? Because even poor Mrs. Norris, wants to improve the parsonage before her husband dies. And her one act of improvement was to plant an apricot tree, which we're told produces fruit that tastes like potatoes, and which probably wasn't the right breed of apricot tree that she'd paid her hard-earned cash for. So, everybody's at it, even at a lower scale. And planting an apricot tree, I suppose, is, equivalent to making your turnips work harder, but it's also socially aspirational. Apricots are a complete luxury. They're not a staple crop. You're growing an apricot tree because you want to have something fancy to put on your table. And that's what even Mrs. Norris is trying to do.
That question of making your turnips work harder, it is, as you've already said, quite important that Sir Thomas's money, he goes to Antigua partly because he needs to be got out of the way so that these terrible things can go on in his absence, like putting on the play. But there is the question that his money comes from slave labour on the plantation in the Caribbean, which does get mentioned, and gets mentioned directly, that Fanny, when he comes home, she's very interested in the slave trade.
And it's only Fanny who wants to talk about it. And her cousins don't want to talk about it at all. They fall immediately silent, as though, she's mentioned going to the lavatory or something. I mean, it's very clearly presented as the backdrop to the improvement that is going on in English society at that point. What I think is quite interesting, is this right, Claire, that we never really know where the Crawfords' money comes from? So the really mercurial...
I don't think we do.
I think it is just an estate. You hear a little bit about Henry Crawford's estate, which he's not really interested in, because he's not really interested in anything except playing with people's feelings. But we don't discover that. And that's curious, because Sir Thomas actually, although he is getting his money from this dark source, is not himself an improver, is he? Mansfield Park is a physically stable environment with very little building work going on. So that, although there must be a connection between the influx of capital through the sugar trade and through chattel slavery and the improvement of estates, that's not made explicit in the case of Mansfield Park itself, I think, which is kind of weird.
No, I think one thing we do know is that the money in the novel is related in some way to speculation, to gambling. That's a thread that runs through. So we know that Sir Thomas's money in Antigua is somehow speculative. It's sort of subject to ups and downs in fortune, and that's why he has to hurry back to his estate to make everything right. And we also know that Tom, the eldest, is prone to gambling and that he fritters away the family money, and that the Crawfords sort of quite suggestively introduce this card game called speculation, which they make the others play, where you sort of fake bet on quantities. So that is one way in which Austen seems to suggest that this kind of money is somehow dirty or immoral, because it's sort of all thematized as speculative, as gambling.
And typically, of course, Fanny Price wants to lose the game, doesn't she? So that her brother, William, wins the money when she, so she pays over the odds for his cards or whatever it might be. So she's not playing the game of speculation at all.
But she does know how to play, and she is good at it. I mean, I think that's the thing about Fanny, that, devious is a too strong a word, but I think there are ways in which Fanny is quite devious. She is very clever. She knows her role. And it's one of the ways in which she sort of avoids being a kind of, sort of incredibly annoying milquetoast or whatever, is that actually she has this cleverness. She's aware of the precariousness of her situation, and she performs this very difficult balancing act.
Yeah, and if I can indulge in a massive spoiler, she wins, doesn't she? I mean, she gets the guy at the end, and she does it by being patient, being quiet, being in the background, but also occasionally being extremely stubborn and sometimes angry. So she's not a completely passive moral agent at all. But I think what she won't do is gamble or take chances. And in a sense, I suppose the crude moral of the fairy tale aspect of Mansfield Park is that if you stick to your virtuous guns, you will eventually win the game. Which is, sadly untrue about life, folks, but it can work in novels.
But she also has, in a sense, she has more to lose, or appears to have more to lose, or is aware of how much she has to lose. That if she plays the game wrong, she's going to be banished from Mansfield Park. I mean, that's what's sort of most at stake for her. And the others will feel secure enough in their social position, their material position, that then they don't really feel that there's that much at stake. Whereas Fanny is aware of what is at stake if she loses.
Yeah. And I think in the sort of her acuteness and the complexity and multifacetedness of her moral thinking as a heroine, she, perhaps alone in the novel, is equal to the complexity of Austen's sort of narration and the complexity of Austen's ethical thinking. And I think we were going to zoom in a bit more detail on a passage that reveals that and how it's used at the expense of characters who definitely are not equal to this sort of complex kind of probing narration that Austen subjects them to. We had a passage, didn't we, from, I think, quite early in the novel, which subjects poor old dumb Mr. Rushworth to this kind of thinking. Colin, take it away for us.
Well. Just before I do, it's worth saying that improvement has a material aspect, as in improving an estate, but it also has a moral aspect. So, I think one of the sort of great acts of charity in this novel is that almost everybody seems at some point to be improvable morally. And, Fanny improves in her looks, and she believes even that Henry Crawford has improved by the end of the novel. But Jane Austen balances that interest in moral improvement with a sense that characters are characters and that character is fate. And people like Mr. Rushworth, they're just dim. So this passage, anyway, is really about the unimprovability of people like Mr. Rushworth. And it's from chapter 19. Turning away towards any or all of the rest, he, Sir Thomas Bertram, tranquilly said, "Mr. and Miss Crawford were mentioned in my last letters from Mansfield. Do you find them agreeable acquaintance?" Tom was the only one at all ready with an answer, but he, being entirely without a particular regard for either, without jealousy, either in love or acting, could speak very handsomely of both. Mr. Crawford was a most pleasant, gentlemanlike man, his sister a sweet, pretty, elegant, lively girl. Mr. Rushworth, who is, of course, jealous, could be silent no longer. "I do not say he is not gentlemanlike, considering, but you should tell your father he's not above 5'8", or he'll be expecting a well-looking man." So, stop laughing, Claire, please.
That's so I imagine Mr. Rushworth speaking. It's
None
wonderful.
of us did. Tom was sprung on us, as always, with the voices.
That's how he speaks.
I have to reconceive everything. Sorry, carry on.
That's how Mr. Rushworth speaks. Believe me. Sir Thomas did not quite understand this and looked with some surprise at the speaker. "If I must say what I think," continued Mr. Rushworth, "in my opinion, it is very disagreeable to be always rehearsing. It is having too much of a good thing. I'm not so fond of acting as I was at first. I think we're a great deal better employed sitting comfortably here among ourselves and doing nothing." Sir Thomas looked again and then replied with an approving smile. "I'm happy to find our sentiments on this subject so much the same. It gives me sincere satisfaction. That I should be cautious and quick-sighted and feel many scruples which my children do not feel is perfectly natural. And equally so that my value for domestic tranquillity, for a home which shuts out noisy pleasures, should much exceed theirs. But at your time of life to feel all this is a most favourable circumstance for yourself and for everybody connected with you, and I am sensible of the importance of having an ally of such weight." Sir Thomas meant to be giving Mr. Rushworth's opinion in better words than he could find himself. He was aware that he must not expect a genius in Mr. Rushworth, but as a well-judging, steady young man with better notions than his elocution would do justice to, he intended to value him very highly. It was impossible for many of the others not to smile. Mr. Rushworth hardly knew what to do with so much meaning. But by looking, as he really felt, most exceedingly pleased with Sir Thomas's good opinion and saying scarcely anything, he did his best towards preserving that good opinion a little longer. Yes,
Okay.
So he just can't cope with that world of complexity where, Sir Thomas Bertram is trying to think well of this idiot who he's going to have as a son-in-law and is trying to find sympathy between their feelings and attitudes to drama. But actually, poor man is an idiot.
And the best thing he can do to preserve that good opinion which has been projected onto him is to stay quiet.
Absolutely. It's always a good strategy.
Yeah.
Having heard Colin's impression, he would do well to be silent for the rest of his life.
And follow Fanny's example. I mean, there's a bit, I don't know if it's before or after that Sir Thomas says that something about how Mr. Rushworth must and would improve in good company, which again is, sadly not true. But the company, in a sense, that Fanny is perhaps the best example to him, but he would never take her as an example because he's not clever enough.
Yeah, and he can't see that Thomas Bertram is trying to help him, and he can't quite see that the others see that Thomas Bertram is trying to help him, and they're thinking what an idiot and how lucky he is to have such a charitable interpretation placed on his actions. And he is just spinning. He cannot deal with that much meaning. It just is too much. It's overload. Yeah, unimprovable.
And as with so many things, it comes out in the play when Fanny refuses to take a part, to say anything at all. I will not speak, I will not act. And all Mr. Rushworth can say is, well, thank goodness you haven't got my part, because I have 42 speeches. What would you do with so many speeches?
Yeah.
Well, maybe you should also not have those speeches.
Yes.
Okay, shall we talk about the M word, which is marriage, which is, of course, the sort of spectre that is hanging over the heads of all the young people and the older people too in this novel, and which, of course, goes along with that idea of improvement, because as Maria Ward shows, and in theory also Maria Bertram, you can improve your fortunes greatly by marriage. You can also go the other way. And marriage, of course, is transactional in this context. And it's also, Austen makes clear, speculative, isn't it? In that sense of it is a gamble.
Marriage is profoundly transactional in this novel and elsewhere in Jane Austen too. And it is, as you say, a gamble. It's a very difficult gamble to win. And, Sir Thomas Bertram talking to Mr. Rushworth and thinking as well as he can of him is in some ways, the gambler wanting there to be 3 aces in his hand, because he knows really deep down that, he's not only not a genius, but a complete idiot. And Maria knows that too. And she knows that she's only going for him because he's got this whopping big estate and all the income that it brings. But she reckons, well, I'll get a house in London out of it, so I'll be quids in on the deal. So there are those material calculations, but there's also, Jane Austen is operating throughout on a very, very delicate point between the purely material and the profoundly emotional. So, Maria basically throws it all away, loses her bet by falling for Henry Crawford, which she can't help herself doing. And he's, he's rich, but actually, the good gambler doubles down, stays with the bet they've made, and she fails. So I think you're absolutely right that it is a speculative venture, and sometimes the speculation works and sometimes it doesn't.
There's that moment in Pride and Prejudice where, almost the moment at which Lizzie falls in love with Darcy is when she goes to visit his house.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm a bit obsessed, but the extent to which people in their houses are, it does change her opinion of him. And that's fine. I don't think there's any necessarily moral censor at all in the books, is there, the idea of marrying someone who's got enough money to make sure you don't have to worry about having enough money.
No, of course not.
That's just sensible.
Yeah.
And it's a form of research. God knows people research their partners nowadays, but back in the day, when you didn't have the opportunities for certain kinds of conversation, going to visit the estate was about as good as it got. And it's all to prevent that sort of comment that Mary makes about how everyone is taken in when they are married. There is not 1 in 100 of either sex who is not taken in when they marry. Look where I will, I see that it is so, and I feel that it must be so, when I consider that it is, of all transactions, the one in which people expect most from others, so those 3 aces in the hand, and are least honest themselves. So research is key. If you don't want to be taken in, you need to walk around that estate.
And we see what's going to happen in Maria's marriage to Mr. Rushworth on the day that they visit Southerton. They're all out in the garden, and it's sort of another spoiler, but it hardly matters, that there's this locked gate, and they send Mr. Rushworth off to find the key, and he's taking ages to get the key. And meanwhile, Maria and Henry Crawford, squeeze through or climb over the gate and go off into the woods outside. And then that's repeated essentially in a slightly different way after Mr. Rushworth and Maria get married. So we see even before they go to Southerton as research for the marriage, and then exactly what's going to go wrong with the marriage goes wrong on that day.
Yeah, and the whole trip to Southerton is sort of explicitly played out as a performance of marriage, isn't it? Because in the extraordinary scene in the chapel at Southerton, you have Maria and Mr. Rushworth sort of up by the altar as though ready to perform a marriage, which doesn't actually take place. And you're absolutely told, this is marriage as theatre, really. And that episode with the climbing through beside the gate, I always have tremendous difficulty visualizing it, because obviously it's got, the symbolism is unusually, perhaps for Jane Austen, crashingly obvious. There are these two naughty people getting through the gate, going out into the wilder space that is contiguous to the more formal gardens, and walking in the forest together, getting off alone to do God knows what in the woods. I mean, it's sort of like Midsummer Night's Dream, really. But actually the practicalities of getting through a chink beside a locked gate when you've got God knows what kind of crinolines on, and I just find it hard to see.
Well, yeah, I can sort of imagine. You can imagine you've got the stone pillar, and then there's a sort of an iron gate, and maybe there's quite a big gap between the hinge, and you can squeeze through if you're slightly built.
But you're in chinos and trainers, Tom, aren't you? I mean, you're not in a great elaborate.
There were no crinolines, Colin.
They're wearing, Empire
They're wearing
line.
Empire line. They're slinky. They can fit through. They're slinky.
Okay,
and
that
actually,
helps me a lot. That helps me a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But Fanny can't follow them. Partly, I wonder if she doesn't have enough. They can change their clothes when they get home. But
right.
I wonder if Fanny has to worry about her clothes in the way that the Miss Bertrams
yeah.
don't. Is that right, Claire?
I mean, I think so. She sort of suggests that, you will tear your gown against those spikes.
Yeah.
And Maria says, oh, well, never mind, Fanny. I and my gown are alive and well. And it simply doesn't matter if she does tear it. And again, that crashing symbolism, you will injure yourself. You will tear yourself on those dangerous spikes, and you will fall into the ha-ha,
Ha-ha, yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Close Readings. You can listen to the full episode and all our other Close Readings series by signing up to our Close Readings subscription. If you're listening in Apple, you can do that just by going to the top of this podcast. Or for Spotify and other podcast apps, go to lrb.me/audio or click on the link in the description.